Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, the rest of the staff at the American Civil War Museum for organizing this virtual talk about my book. And here I'm going to brandish it alongside my picture, Colossal Ambitions, Confederate Planning for a Post-Civil War World. And thank you all so much for joining us today. It's afternoon here, of course, in Arizona and California, evening over with yourselves in Virginia. And perhaps there may be a couple of intrepid Brits for whom it's very much nighttime for you. But anyhow, I will not, you'll be glad to hear, be putting up any death by PowerPoint slides this evening. Illustrations for this talk can be found, Kelly mentioned, at the wonderful exhibit Southern Ambitions, open at the museum. And I just want to add how much I enjoyed my year as an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the American Civil War Museum, back in those carefree days of 2017 and 2018, working with Mika Downey, Anna Edwards, and Chris Graham on the exhibit, which was based on my scholarship, but I also want to add on so much else. And I certainly, and this will be my last plug for the book, I think working and learning as part of a team made me write a better book, copies of which I gather are available from the bookstore. The war, this is a quote, the war divides, separates, despoils, and destroys, until it seems as if all old things are passing away, and as if the nations, north and south, and all things in them were becoming new. These are the words of Henry Alexander Wise, the oldest brigadier general in the Confederate Army, acting major general and former governor of Virginia, in a letter to his wife that he wrote at the midnight hour between November the 13th and November the 14th from his headquarters near Charleston, South Carolina, sleep having been rendered impossible on account of the noise of the naval bombardment by US gunboats on nearby Fort Sumter, by now had already been reduced to a heap of rubble. The general had been busy the previous fortnight, agreeably so. He had entertained Jefferson Davis on his visit, including beating him in a horse race, writing public letters on the administration's future financial policies, and enjoying the active social calendar as befits an officer on General Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard's command, as well as doing his bit to hold off the Union assault on Charleston. And in the midst of these preparations and preoccupations, Wise thought about the Confederacy once the conflict was over, not only as a distraction from the war, but also as a way to understand the war's significance and to make sense that somehow the present trials would become the cause of future power and prosperity. And many other leading Confederates, including otherwise feuding politicians and rivals such as Davis, Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, Representative Henry Stewart Foote, together with planters, merchants, journalists, men and women, Rose Green Howe, Augusta Jane Evans, and Verena Davis, these individuals believed that while the Civil War raged on, they were on the threshold of a new great power that they commanded. And this great power was arriving on the world stage. And they spoke about these aspirations together with plans to implement them in meetings of commercial conventions, in diplomatic correspondence, in congressional debates, and editorials in newspapers, and more at length in pamphlets and even in a novel. And they were a group of individuals battling for survival who were also, to repeat, convinced of the global significance of the Southern bid for independence. And they were not in any doubt whatsoever as to the success of this enterprise. And indeed, they saw the war as a kind of catalyst, if you will, rendering a shortcut to national greatness apparently feasible, a sort of speeding up of the process of nation building by the mobilization, the rapid change, the industrialization, the very scale of the war. And, which was brought home, as why showed, with this noise, this destruction going on all around them. Incorporating this ambitious vision, the urgency of which required planning in wartime, into our understanding of why Confederates seceded and then fought the war, is not to exclude those other factors, those individuals' disagreements and doubts with which we're familiar from much of the scholarship on the Confederacy. Anxiety, victimhood, and sacrifice, juxtaposed with this sort of confident aspiration about the future. These great expectations, to coin a title of a famous 1861 novel by Charles Dickens, read widely across the Confederacy and America during the war, these great expectations were shared by many. And these people, these Confederate planners, as I call them in the book, included both formerly reluctant and enthusiastic secessionists. They encompassed refugees from the border states, those states that did not leave the Union, but these refugees believed were waiting for that moment when these states would exercise their sovereign rights and choose to join the Confederacy. And alongside proud conservative Virginians and the aggressive clearers of the new lands across the Deep South and Texas. And even Unionists such as Sam Houston, the recently fired governor of Texas, would embrace an enlarged vision for the new nation as a sort of next best alternative to remaining in the United States. And in my talk this evening, and repeat, you're welcome to interrupt me. Kelly's going to field the questions, but if you've got questions as we go, please do so. But in my talk, which won't go on too long, I trust, this evening, I'm going to set out the economic and infrastructure, the basis for this vision, and then look for what the government planned about its relations with the Confederacy's two neighbors, Mexico and the United States. And I will certainly say that the picture on the cover, I've seen that question come up, is of Windsor Ruins, which is, if you've not been there, I recommend it, on the Natchez Trace Parkway, running between Jackson, Mississippi, southwards to Port Gibson. Actually, and you can see Grant's famous march on Vicksburg. Is that a wonderful place to visit? Anyhow, that's what I'm going to talk about today. So talk a bit about I'm going to really try and treat this talk to show you about the Confederacy as a nation. Because that, I think, is something, because of course it never happened. That's why it's been overlooked, but it mattered to people at the time. So I'm going to sort of bring you into the world. And that means a bit of economics, more than a bit. Because when they talked about this Confederate vision, they conceived it as sort of arising logically. These Confederate planners, saw it as arising logically from the trends, from the events that they construed were happening around them from the late 1840s throughout the 1850s. They conceived, and this is difficult for us to get our heads around, but they conceived that international abolition was apparently in decline. But even the anti-slavery powers were allegedly considering large-scale adoption of indentured servitude as the second best alternative to slavery. On top of that was the triumph, apparently, of free trade principles led by Great Britain. This new world order that they saw coming into being will be one of trade deals between nations, commercial pacts, lowering tariffs, export tariffs and import duties, following the precedent of the 1860 Cobden Chevalier Agreement between Britain and France, and very much influenced by the Zollverein Customs Union that had increased the prosperity of the German Confederation. And at the same time, and this is important, these deals served as proof that mutual economic prosperity need not necessitate political union. Forgive me if I start perspiring. I think the Arizonan heat is entering my office. Forgive me. It is hot here, but it's hot everywhere. That these deals, these free trade deals, show that mutual economic collaboration, cooperation would not necessitate political union. And then there's the first industrial revolution, spreading from Great Britain to New England in the US and then into the Midwest, in France and Belgium and into Germany, again, rendering Confederate planters and merchants excited about the opportunities that were opening up for them once they had achieved their independence. They didn't want to join the first industrial revolution and build factories across the South. Rather, they conceived commercial agriculture to be the superior occupation and expected to become and remain the supplier of choice to these new manufacturing economies of the world. Only the slavery-based plantation economy spreading from the South, fueled by African-American population growth, would provide reliable, mass-produced cotton and other staple crops like rice, coffee, sugar, tobacco to sustain these industries and also stimulate their workers. This Confederate economy would expand into other forms of resource extraction, including mining and lumber. Davis and his colleagues believed that slavery was the most humane as well as the most efficient means of production. They considered that to force white workers to labor in these conditions would lead to revolutionary upheavals. 1848, the revolutions in Europe, this was very much in their minds as well. Journalists in the Confederacy insisted that the world's leading industrial powers, Britain, France, and the United States itself, had begun to realize the superiority of slavery. And that Britain and France were already, this was a stretch, but they believed that Britain and France were already regretting the precipitate emancipation of enslaved people in their Caribbean colonies. And they looked at the world around them. They saw these events that, along with commercial pacts, Confederates interpreted various initiatives of the Anglo-French Entente during the late 1850s around the world, including the Second Opium War against China, the suppression of the Indian Mutiny, activities in Indochina, Syria, and North Africa, the construction of the Suez Canal, as unmistakable steps toward obtaining supplies of contract laborers and opening markets for an interdependent free trade world economy. Confederates expected that the Civil War would decide whether this vision would triumph. In contrast, the policies of the Republican Party in the US, including its support for higher export tariff, offered a glimpse of a different future, one that was championed by the revisionist powers in Europe and those they called the Russian Empire and Bismarck's Prussia. And these despotisms and Confederates included the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln, so they called it, in this category. Now, these countries were putting up an alternative world vision of increasing national power through competitive zero-sum beggar thy neighbor tariffs, fighting wars, and the development of self-sufficient national economies. Confederates believed these moves threatened their national mission, which was to create a world safe for slavery. And they believed this ambition to be possible, as it was the continuation of the positive to them trends of the 1850s, namely to integrate the South, slavery, and cotton production ever more deeply into the global economy. Therefore, the priority was to increase cotton production and export, and to achieve that not only by developing the South, with Texas as a new frontier, but to pursue expansion of both slavery and the cultivation of cotton, and to repeat other enterprises further south and west. What they did not want to do, these Confederate policymakers did not want to do, was to pursue economic independence. For them, safeguarding the future of slavery was by expanding it and to becoming more interconnected with the world economy by increasing exports and imports. And trade was more than a protector of slavery and a deliverer of prosperity. It promised a way to generate world peace by increasing the interdependence of national economies. Confederates readily adopted the theory of comparative advantage in political economy, which was a process which they understood by national economies specializing in and relying on sources from abroad to provide what its citizens found uneconomic to make for themselves. Commerce would civilize, and the Civil War was a fight for these values. For example, the Union's blockade was seen as a move against that. A war crime, they judged it, as a symptom of barbarism and tyranny. Blockades, they reasoned, belonged to the past, suggestive of the ways things had been done, not the way that they would be done in the future. So they saw their future as one of international collaboration and pursuit of mutual advantage. Confederate system of slavery, sustained staple crop production, resource extraction would extend across the Western Hemisphere, and Confederates expected the adoption of a Texas model of planting colonies. This is their way they plan to expand, of slaveholders and enslaved people being invited in by Mexican provincial governors starting in Sonora, and that this process would gather momentum, while the existing slave powers, Spain and Cuba, Puerto Rico, and expanding back into Santo Domingo, along with Brazil, would be natural allies in this quest. Slavery's superiority, moral and economic, would mean that it would outcompete the rival planting of indentured servants by the British, French, and Danish, and together with the Lincoln administration's own plans to encourage freed people to colonize the Caribbean and Central America. There would be room for these alternative labor systems in the world as a whole, but not in the Western Hemisphere and not directly competing in the market for white gold. That's what they call cotton, that the Confederates would predominate. Now, Kelly, I'm going to pause there because I sort of run through my initial economic vision. Are there any questions that you would, give people a chance to just come up with any questions, and then I'll resume again?
And can everyone hear me now? How do I sound? I know I was cutting out earlier.
You are much better.
Okay, so it does look like you have a few questions. Someone asked that since Confederate leaders envisioned slavery's expansion into South America after winning Confederate independence, what did they have in mind for the status of Spanish-speaking people whose lands the Confederacy would expand into? And did they envision treating them as conquered peoples or making them second-class citizens?
That's an excellent question. I'll touch on this later, but I'm going to just say now that they saw themselves as creating a hierarchy of races. So the Spanish speaking, there would be, if you like, the Hispanic immigrants would be the Creoles would be at a higher level. The mixed race, the mestizos would be at a lower level. Native Americans, African Americans in a hierarchy of races. That is all. They saw their empire as one that was more multiracial than the United States. But it was most certainly not equal and democratic.
And then another question about what evidence did the Confederate planners believe that the abolitionist movement was waning? So why did they think it was waning?
Yes, this is always very surprising. There was certainly a relaxing of the British attempts to stamp out the international slave trade in the Atlantic. It was carrying on in the Indian Ocean. And the reason for that was that the Americans were refusing to cooperate to an extent. So they saw, and there was a reduction in the activities of the American Anti-Slavery Society and the British Anti-Slavery Society at this time. Of course, they saw it through their own lens. But so they look at things going on abroad and they say that reinforces our view. The important takeaway is that they didn't see slavery as on its way out, and that they actually saw the international system moving towards a benign accommodation of slavery, and the dislike of it was more on account of its being so competitive towards alternative labor systems.
And by around 1863, as the war turned against the Confederacy, did these Confederate visionaries realize their dream was a delusion?
They reinvented it. I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go, but it's difficult. I mean, they looked at the circumstances around them, and I think, and I'm going to reaffirm this point as we go. We know from hindsight that we know that they were deluded, but they did not think so at the time. Whereas reading forward in the evidence, what they saw was that they would have to reinvent. I call it rebooting, almost, or use a technology for it, that they had to, right, the world is not as we would want it to be. It isn't quite as I'm setting out here. It's changing. And so we had to adapt towards it. What they never ceased to believe was that there would come a point when all their efforts would achieve something, that the United States would sit down and negotiate with them. That there would be, if the meaning of independence might have to be refought, they might have to be within the United States, but it is very, very late indeed in the day that they come to a view that they are going to, well, the alternative is they're going to get crushed, degradation, wiped off the face of the earth. That there is this sort of, and that's not, so therefore they must continue to fight for this alternative. Okay, it's a set of choices that we don't quite understand in hindsight, but it's the choices that they felt at the time. It's this way or oblivion, and they kept on saying, well, they will come around. There will be a point when all we've done will not be in vain, and that it will win us some kind of compensated, even when they come to accept, well, I'll talk about how slavery begins to, how they think about how to reform slavery and how to compromise on their independence. But they're constantly saying, we are still having an input into the outcome here. We are not going to get dictated to.
And I think that was it for right now.
I'll move on. We'll have another, I'll give you a pause and then we'll pause at the end. I'm sort of, about halfway through. So you get the gist. I'm going to talk very briefly about infrastructure, because this sort of gets into their sort of, their mentality. The new nation would be an economic powerhouse, facilitator of world peace. It would act as a communications highway, from mundane international postal agreements to more exotic steamship lines, canals, a southern continental railroad with a terminus on the Pacific Ocean in the Mexican port of Guaymas, even a transoceanic telegraph cable of their own, again following a southern route. This is across the Atlantic. In a similar fashion to interdependence, and this, I want to get this point across here, in a similar fashion to this economic interdependence through free trade and comparative advantage, a communications revolution on an international scale would provide security for slavery. Diplomats and travelers in Europe believed anti-slavery sentiment there, as well as in the United States, arose from jealousy or prejudice, part of that sort of competitive model of beggar thy neighbor economics, or from ignorance and union propaganda. As more evidence flowed, as more information flowed from publications such as The Index, a State Department funded weekly newspaper published in London, and direct business done between textile manufacturers and slaveholders, instead of having brokers from New York acting as go-betweens, you would do direct business, direct trade. This familiarity and visible dependence on slavery would lead to its acceptance. And eventually, you know, even naive aristocrats abroad, like the Duchess of Sutherland, would see through the lies and distortions performed by sentimental propagandists from the Harriet Beecher Stowe school. Instead, foreigners and northerners would, with improved information, consult their self-interest in preserving a labor system that enabled the global standard of living to rise by the provision of cheap commodities. And to safeguard this trading empire and its merchant marine, Confederates expected that they would need to possess a powerful navy. And again, a shortcut was miraculously available, given that the coming of the screw-propelled ironclad rendered those massive wooden fleets suddenly obsolete. Confederates with just a dozen or so ironclads would immediately become a world-class naval power. And again, the war was sort of accelerating this, and indeed was making this future more necessary. They would need a thriving export-driven economy, because if, as the Treasury Department increasingly was worried, a massive debt would have to be paid off at the end of the war. There would have to be a lapse in time before peacetime post-war prosperity would arrive. But planters were confident of their ability to dump on the market a massive and growing cotton stockpile, amounting to millions of bales stored in warehouses across the Confederacy. That would re-establish market share, undercut competitors abroad, whether based in India or Egypt, and quickly re-establish market share. The Confederacy as a credit-worthy nation, they called it, offering big returns for foreign and northern investors. Now, the Colossal ambitions has a chronological structure, and sort of to show how, as one of the two of you have already asked, the war's continuance and intensification necessitated changes and amendments to this Confederate national plan. In Congress, for example, legislators debated how slavery would have to be reformed after the war, and the plantation economy diversified by means of a Homestead Act that dispersed ownership of enslaved people to Confederate veterans. Meanwhile, in the State Department, diplomats searched ways to hunt out ways to build alliances and achieve greater prosperity, economic and military security in a world less ideal than the Confederates would have liked it to be. And what I want to just do is briefly show you how the Davis administration adjusted itself to events in the war by revisiting its interactions with its two neighbors, Mexico and above all, the United States. And the future of Mexico and of the Southwest, California, Arizona, and New Mexico, where I am, performed a large role in Confederate planning. Even while the focus of the fighting was east of the Mississippi River, they looked to the West and the South. Why? Well, slavery expansion, the control of the commerce, or at least having a say in the commerce, a share of the commerce crossing the Pacific Ocean, will be the foundation of the next phase of the growth of the world economy and the future of future geopolitical rivalries. And the gateway to the Pacific would be via Mexico. And over their neighbor, the Confederate State Department sought to exercise a predominant influence. And the means and modes of control would change. Agents on the ground toyed with fostering separatism of provincial governors, promotion of colonization schemes, consideration of outright annexation, seeking of more modest concessions such as free ports and rights of transit. And the arrival of the French in Mexico did not disturb or change these plans. These are looking to the future, and they look beyond. I mean, when diplomats and adventurers in Paris, Richmond are on the spot, well, they believed that the volatile French Emperor Napoleon III, well, he was obsessed with European geopolitics, and he would involving revising the Congress of Vienna that ended his uncle's empire, and would soon move off elsewhere. What they looked to in Mexico, provincial governors, conservatives in Mexico City, were the foundations of a vision for Latin America. In some respects, they certainly saw this as the opposite to the US and the Monroe Doctrine. The Davis administration wanted to make Latin America safe for slavery, open to commercial penetration. And they saw that racial hierarchy we've already spoken about briefly, Creoles ruling over mestizos, Latin Americans, African Americans in that order. They would seek allies with conservative, clerical, and perhaps even monarchical regimes with some European aid. The people, the Confederate planners, agents in Mexico City, in the State Department in Richmond, Judah Benjamin, etc., they believed that the people of Latin America were not yet ready for Republican self-government. With Latin America as their sphere of influence, Confederates believed that they, not the British or the French, would be guarantors of these regimes, not the United States. They had lost this role because they had made the mistake of thinking that democracy and Republican self-government, they forgot that that was only for advanced races, and Northerners, by succumbing to majority dictatorship, have forgotten this rule. Now, the ambition and scope of these specific plans for expansion ebbed and flowed with the expected duration of the Civil War. Sometimes when the war was going especially badly, militarily, these visions became much vaguer, even abstract. And this sort of vague free trade imperialism, displacing anything concrete, would predominate. While specific events in the war, like General Henry H. Sibley's expedition to New Mexico, the intrigues of adventurers such as ex-US Senator William M. Gwynn, would also influence the nature and direction of these policies by opening and then closing opportunities. But the importance of Mexico and the Southwest to Confederates is shown that how these intended negotiators, this is my final sort of part of the talk, which really want to get to, and this really predominated at this delusional period that we've already talked about. Well, they said, right, we are going to have negotiators with the United States, and we are prepared to sort of work with them in terms of the right to exploit these lands in any settlement that they propose to end the war with the US. And in the closing months of the war, members of the Davis administration, including both president and vice president, surrendered their hopes for a free hand in Latin America and instead proposed a joint plan of expansion with the Federals. And they believe that the vision of a new huge union that included Canada and also extended southward all the way to Panama and possibly even beyond, would by virtue of its size and racial complexity dilute the power of the northern majority. In true Madisonian fashion, this diverse republican empire would enable sufficient autonomy at home for Southerners to retain slavery, to resume the export of cotton to world markets from within the loose confines of a new United States. And Davis, again, they hear what they want to hear. And Davis considered what he took to be tacit acceptance of this plan to be the outcome of his discussions with veteran Missouri Democrat Francis Preston Blair in Richmond during January 1865. And when Stevens the following month, Alexander H. Stevens the following month, he repeatedly put this joint expansion plan up for consideration by Lincoln and Secretary of State William H. Seward at Hampton Roads. They were prepared to compromise their Latin American plans to address federal concerns. And this is my sort of the final point to make, that of all the relations, international relations, the one that mattered most to them would be the United States. And at times they even believed that the Federals, some of them, would assist slaveholders in the achievements of their objectives. Lincoln feared this. The Confederates hoped that the success of their secession would precipitate a further fragmentation of the United States. They were confident, and we've already mentioned this, that the remaining slave states that stayed in the Union, well, they were held in there by a tyranny, that after peace they would hold conventions and join the Confederacy. Agents in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, reported to Richmond that Native Americans preferred the Confederate rule to that of the supposedly more oppressive Federals. And the map of North America will not stop at being redrawn with a 15-state confederacy plus New Mexico and Indian territories. There'll be new nations would appear. A Pacific Ocean confederacy west of the continental divide, and most importantly in the short term, a Midwest, or as its boosters at the time termed it, a Northwest confederacy based on the secession of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Their intelligence sources and interpretation of Northern newspaper coverage, of which a lot of papers poured over, they believe that Northern Democrats and Copperheads, in their demand for peace, were actually hiding a much greater demand, which was that they were seething under Republican Party tyranny, that they were actually plotting a military uprising that was always imminent, and even more likely than that, when the Democrats won the election in November 1864, when they won the US presidential election, of course they didn't, but they expected them to do so. Well, in the aftermath of that, there'd be an armistice, and these states would orderly secede from the United States. They believed that Midwestern farmers and New York merchants loathed New England-sponsored tariffs. They opposed the war they were lukewarm on abolition, and they resented increased federal government power. And the Confederates believed that they were in a position to offer inducements, like an agreement for the entire Mississippi-Missouri basin to become the basis of a Zollverein-style customs union, a free trade area that would appeal to disaffected Midwesterners. Friendship would follow with commercial pacts, free navigation of the river, to give, and this is back to this sort of Confederate sort of belief that runs through, that their economic advantages of a of a union without political squabbles over slavery and race. Trade would resume a north-south pattern, but only federal government subsidies had diverted into east-west patterns, like canals, like the Erie Canal or the newer railroads. There would be a re-establishment of older natural patterns of trade. Economic interest would join political opposition to Lincoln's tyranny to guide Midwesterners towards an alliance with the Confederacy. And that the Confederacy, with access to the Pacific via Southern California and or Northwest Mexico, would become first among equals in this new map of North America, with its security guaranteed by a balance of power diplomacy imported from Europe. So that is that even with the sort of becoming of the even as we move towards the end of the conflict, okay, that the Confederate government believed that they did not regard themselves as ceasing to have a role in determining their future. They insisted that something had gone wrong with republicanism in the US, that Lincoln's re-election and continued prosecution of the war signified tyranny of the majority, or as they called it, mob democracy. And at the same time, and Lincoln's ambiguity sometimes was misconstrued. This talk of unconditional emancipation and reunion, well, they saw that as bluff, that Northerners would settle for something short of reunion and emancipation, that they would get something in return for peace, concessions, and that to the very end, they still believe that they would be able to offer something, enter into negotiations, and that in the correspondence of Davis, in his cabinet discussions, in congressional debates, and in the chatter of Richmond drawing rooms, there circulated creative propositions of plebiscites, all-state conventions, customs unions, military and foreign policy alliances, and even a sort of American diet, a sort of small committee running the country, along with older ideas like John C. Calhoun's dual presidency, or even a reversion to the Articles of Confederation. And even as the members of the government scattered in the wake of the fall of Richmond, they still assumed the Lincoln administration would not wish to dictate the terms of peace. Reunion by coercion, they don't want that. Isn't the 13th Amendment itself a negotiation ploy to get a better deal? Is it enforceable? Whatever happens, and this is where I will end, there had to be a meeting of equals, two sets of commissioners after an armistice would meet to hammer out terms. And something would turn up. These eternal optimists insisted. The only member of the commission who went to meet Lincoln and Seward, the only one who went public, well, Robert M.T. Hunter said, we are going to expand. He told a crowd of 10,000 people gathered at the African Methodist Church in snowbound Richmond in February 1865, we are going to expand both races to the south of us. Maybe we'll move off down south in this wider empire. Lee would continue to fight, while the inherent contradictions of the policies of the Lincoln administration would be revealed to all. So there was shock and disbelief at the end, and this is my final point, that the Civil War had to be fought and won, that the Union had to destroy a would-be world power committed both to the retention and expansion of slavery and to the further breakup of what remained of the United States. So thank you all for listening. And Kelly, are you going to now take back, if you can be heard, the chat function for any more questions? Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Adrian. That was great. And I can definitely see why Colossal Ambitions is the title for your book, because those are some colossal ambitions. on the part of the Confederates. So there are some questions, and this first one is somewhat long, so bear with me as I kind of go through it. But he says there were Southerners who saw writing on the wall the end of slavery, knew this from the Emancipation Proclamation, also the confiscation of slaves, just as the British had done in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Prescient Southerners cashed out their proprieties in the U.S. and moved to Brazil. So the question is, what scholarship exists that study the decisions to immigrate by these Southerners and the timing of their immigration to Brazil?
I will definitely share there is some books. There's a book by Wallstrom. I forget the actual title of it, but there is, and I have been, funny enough, I've been writing a chapter, a sort of epilogue. Many went to Mexico and also Brazil after the end of the war. Some to prop up slavery, others because they saw their future with this sort of Mexican conservative empire with whom they expected to collaborate. Virginians Lee said, come home and help rebuild the South. Most Virginians headed back. Some Texans remained, however, in Mexico. And I think it's this sort of diaspora, if you will, followed this sort of, my view on it is, Confederates thought an awful lot about these countries during the war, so it was almost natural that there's sort of a slow motion continuation of some of these ideas. Some of them, there are a variety of motives. Some thought that they would be, particularly in Mexico, maybe as a sort of dropping off point to seek revenge on the United States, but many more believe that they would be able to make, either shore up the Mexican empire or the Brazilian empire as a sort of carrying on of those imperial aspirations that they developed as Confederates during the war.
And can you talk a little bit about what their level of success was?
Well, in Mexico, the empire fell in 1867, although they still carried on working there until 1871. And I think, there was certainly in Brazil as well, there was they stayed there for a few years, but the plans in Mexico failed by the end of the 1860s. I mean the Brazilian ones, I think, carried on sometime after that, I gather.
And then another question, since the Confederate commissioners at Hampton Roads Conference discussed the prospect of a joint Union-Confederate expulsion of the French from Mexico, did they make this conditional upon recognition of Confederate sovereignty?
Well, certainly, Lincoln said, I will have none of this. I want to be absolutely clear about what Lincoln said to this. And the Confederate commissioners just sort of went, as I said, they went quiet, other than one who seemed to carry on as if nothing had happened. I hasten to add that the one who went public privately said, well, that's a writing on the wall. Confederates, again, they heard what they wanted to hear. Francis Blair, in that meeting with Davis, talked about one nation, but that maybe we would conquer South. He said Davis would be the commander of the armies. That an expeditionary force that would move off down south. This is Blair saying that, but he said that it would have to be within the context of one nation. And Blair said this was with a load of other things that he was talking about. That means Blair was saying with the end of slavery, etc. Davis took away two nations, with the South moving off, conquering into Mexico and beyond. So it is a what these discussions constantly have is you have sort of two sort of sides passing each other in the night, almost, so to speak. But there was that they, with their mindset, they genuinely believe that they would somehow, if the worst case scenario would be that Confederates and their slaves would migrate south to Mexico, would diffuse out. And there's, this is a long history in 19th century America of diffusion arguments, where slavery is always moving south. And that their Kate much of the United States and leave that to free labor whilst moving south. I mean, it's a fascinating sort of look into the mentality of these people.
So thinking about the importance of your work, it seems to underscore that slavery was the cause, or preserving slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And so how did the alternate view that this is fought over states' rights, how did that come so quickly to be the gospel, the truth?
Because obviously the lost cause this is the antithesis of the lost cause memory of the war in every respect. That is to sort of reconcile themselves to defeat. State rights is an explanation of the defeat because it's a disunited nation, as Jefferson Davis famously said, we died of a theory, in a fact that the Confederate government couldn't fight the war efficiently because it was a decentralized political entity. So, state rights becomes important as an explanation of defeat. And at the end of the war, when slavery was dead, slavery was no longer a contemporary political issue. When the former Confederates wanted to re-enter the political mainstream, rejoin the Democrat Party, they had to sign up to the platter of issues of the Democratic Party platform. There was no sort of policy plan to restoring slavery. None. But what there was a continued campaign for things like free trade or lower tariffs, and also for power to the states. So if you like, the lost cause is, you've got to see it through the post-war. To understand the lost cause is to understand the South after 1865. The lost cause is lousy at understanding the Confederacy itself, because yes, slavery is their economy, it's their society, it's their future. You can't disentangle the Confederacy from slavery. But the lost cause is a way to adjust to a new world. Some continuities, but what was emphatic was in order to remain politically relevant, in order to sort of reintegrate into the political mainstream, slavery is wiped clean. State rights and the mythologization of the heroic army backing against the odds. Whereas this shows that Confederates believed that they would win the war by securing a degree of their independence. They weren't fighting to lose it.
So did Confederate advocates try to promote their foreign policy goals in the Northern press to see if Northern voters would have supported their views?
Well, this is a very interesting question because, they debated all about this. And the important thing was that they wanted the Democrats to win the election in the North. Therefore, they don't want the Democrats to be tainted by treason. So therefore, the view, although, there are various schemes to set up printing presses, etc., especially in the Midwest and these sort of secretive societies, but the administration's policy is keep quiet, let the Democrats win the election, and then we'll see. Because whatever the Democrats said about reunion, the Confederates were utterly convinced that once George B. McClellan won the presidency in November 1864, there'd be an armistice and all bets were off. Once the armies stopped fighting, the whole sort of war effort would collapse. And then after that, well, then all those schemes and propagandas would come off. Until then, the Confederacy must keep very quiet because it doesn't want to damage the chances of the Democrats winning their election on their policy platform. They got enough divisions among themselves between war and peace factions, etc., without us Confederates creating more problems for them.
And I think with that, you somewhat answered at least the first part of the last questions about how well were the ambitions understood in the North, but also to what extent did this impact Grant's strategy toward the South?
Well, all I'll say is Lincoln understood the ambitions all too well, I think. That this foe had to be fought and destroyed. And Grant understood that. I mean, what I think this is, that was Civil War, the hard war faction, those who understood, the Confederacy wasn't about coexistence and or about reunion on a sort of, so the deluded people were people like George B. McClellan. Lincoln understood all too well that this had to be destroyed, and that you had to take it down and spurn all their offers of anything short than reunion and emancipation. But that was the right policy choice, because to negotiate with these people, I mean, I think what I've said here, there's a whole different world vision, a whole different future of trading relations or geopolitics, that their quest to secure slavery would entail them going off on these schemes that involved the transformation. So Lincoln's right, Grant's right. You've got to take it down. You can't negotiate. They thought they could negotiate, but the Northerners were right. No.
We're basically out of time, but one last question that just popped up, and I think it's a good one. So prior to the firing on Fort Sumter, Mayor Fernando Wood of New York proposed New York secede from the Union, become an independent city-state so they could continue to trade with the Confederacy. If Wood's scheme had succeeded, how would this have fit into Confederate visions for world power and slave-based world market?
Absolutely central to it. I say that's a great question. No, they were very excited about that, and even New Jersey might have seceded as well. So they believed that the New Yorkers, and they picked this, and this will be the foundations of the Democrat Party after the war. There's Alliance of the South in New York, free trade, decentralized, and anti sort of what they saw as moralizing big government New Englanders. They conveniently forgot Lincoln in this kind of mentality. And so that New York was an ally in that quest. And that again, this sort of idea of, that once the New Yorkers are practical business people, and that once economics, they saw them as even the Yankees in a while might open their eyes to doing business. It's that kind of, we are the moral people here, you are the materialists, you're going to do business with it. And the New Yorkers were, especially with their liking of free trade, would be natural allies in that quest.
Thank you, Adrian. And as many people have put into the chat feature, excellent talk. And I think there was a question about where to get the book. Certainly it's available other places, but definitely through our shop. And I have been told that even though we don't have signed books yet, we will find a way to get books signed or to get book plates with Adrian's signature on them. So keep that in mind if you're interested to purchase the book. I also had a few people, I know at the beginning, say they couldn't hear me. So just a quick recap of announcements. August 6th, which is not this Thursday, but next Thursday, a book talk on women's suffrage in the Civil War. You can go to our website, acwm.org, to learn more about that. We'll have 2 authors. And then August 10th is our next History Happy Hour, which is focused on the African-American fight for freedom with Wisteria Perry from Mariners Museum. So thank you all for joining us. Sorry about the glitchy sound on my end, but excellent talk, Adrian. Great seeing you, even if it is just virtually.
Thank you all. I really enjoy that. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for your time this evening. It was a privilege. Really enjoyed your questions. Thank you so much.